This is designed to be a follow-up conversation to what I shared in the sermon in the service earlier this morning about forgiveness. One of the things that I think is so difficult about this subject is, and it is kind of why I used the concept of story throughout the sermon, because we all have unique stories as it pertains to forgiveness. And we've got, I think, some very thoughtful people to help us explore some of the more complex issues of forgiveness. But we also have deep respect for the fact that your story is unique. We don't have X-ray vision into your life, but we have great compassion and just want this to be a helpful time. So let me open in a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you for the courage that it actually takes. I was saying that to Pam Cooner earlier today. It is talk about vulnerable thing. It's a vulnerable thing to talk about areas of injury in our life. It's even difficult to take a step and be at a luncheon like this where we're going to go a little bit deeper. Use this time, Father, in ways that only you can, and bring healing in our lives. We pray. Thank you for this food and for those joining me on this panel discussion. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So with me today is, first of all, Melissa Ramsey, longtime city church-erite. Is that a thing? Yeah, give it up for Melissa. Melissa, I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about bio because I'm assuming you know a little bit more about our other two panelists today. Whoops, my iPad keeps jumping on me. Melissa is a licensed professional counselor. She received her undergraduate degree from Vanderbilt and then her master in education counseling from U of H. Who's from U of H out there? Okay, all right. She is the founder and owner of Revere Counseling and Wellness here in Houston. And I personally just have a lot of respect for you, Melissa. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Of course, of course.
Chelsey Omoregie is our City Kids director. And Chelsey we're going to talk a little bit about children and families, but she's here not primarily in that role, but just a good conversation partner I have found on this subject. And then give it up for Clint Wilson. Clint is, I know, that was a little weird. It's just such a heavy subject. I'm trying to produce a little levity here. But Clint is our pastor of community and care. And so let's get started. Let me start, Melissa, with you. Forgiveness can be a really complicated process. Instead of thinking of it as a transaction, it's more of a journey. Can you talk a little bit about that journey, that ongoing process of forgiveness as you see it?
Yeah, so I want to say first, before we speak, kind of echoing what Leo said, is that there are things that happen to us that are really difficult to imagine forgiving, much less ever forgetting. And so I like to tell my clients that there's work that they can do, there's work that the client and I can do in my office, and then there's work that they can only do with God. And so I think as part of that process that Leo's referring to is it's an ongoing, forgiveness in my mind is an ongoing journey. I think when I work with kiddos, I tell their parents that kids reprocess things at each developmental stage. And so things look different at 4, then they do at 13, then they do at 18, then they do at 40. And I think part of the journey of forgiveness is being willing to look back at some of the things that we've experienced and almost like a scar of sorts of like, what color is the scar now? Is it raised? Is it smaller? Do I notice it? How did it change me? But it's an ongoing process. I wish it was a one and done type thing, but I've never seen that personally or professionally with the complex.
I guess that's encouraging.
Yeah.
What do you think the relationship is between forgiveness and like self-healing?
Yeah, so I appreciated that you brought up that research study from Johns Hopkins. There is a ton of research that shows that there actually are physical and emotional and mental benefits to forgiveness. That Anne Lamott quote about rat poison. I mean, I think carrying resentment and hatred can eat you alive. And so I think in that sense, there's absolutely benefit to looking at, okay, why am I still giving this person so much power by hating them and thinking about it so much? And what can I do to kind of let some of those things go?
So what do you think about the idea that forgiveness means forgetting?
I don't know if that's, I think, sorry, this is a complicated one. So I work mostly with trauma, and I think that our body holds the score, our body holds the trauma that we've experienced. I think there are
That would
things,
make a good book title.
yeah, I think someone might have written that book. I think there are absolutely things that we can forgive someone and move forward and say, okay, like I forgive you for speaking to me that way. And now I can have a boundary with you that keeps you from hurting me, but I can still be in relationship with you. But I think with some of the bigger things, maybe a better analogy is like, how do we carry it? So I think a lot of times when we experience something traumatic, it is this like overwhelming boulder we carry on our backs. And then with time and processing and prayer and community, it gets more manageable to carry. And so then maybe it becomes like a backpack, and then maybe it becomes like an over-the-shoulder bag, and then maybe it's like a bracelet. And I think when I can see it that way, I can say, okay, this can be manageable. Like we can figure out a way to live within what we've experienced, and maybe we can move towards forgiveness. But I don't think we necessarily forget.
That's a really helpful analogy. I'm going to get there in just one second, but let's stay on this for just 1 minute. I like the idea of the boulder and then the backpack.
Yeah, and you get used to carrying the weight, and then you take it
off. So if the weight is light enough, you actually might momentarily forget about it, right? But then I imagine something happens, triggers.
Yep.
What do we do then? When it went from being like, oh, I don't feel anything to, oh, there's the boulder again.
Right. I was telling Clint I went to the chiropractor this morning because I bent down to get the remote and was like, right? Oh, my neck, and it's like you think you're fine and happy, and then all of a sudden you're like, I can't turn my head anymore. And I think that's when it's like we go to the professionals. We go to the people that we trust who can pray for us, who can help us sit with this new pain and figure out, okay, what do I need to do with this today? So yeah.
That's good. Chelsey, talk a little bit about emotions. When someone, it's raw and you do not feel ready to forgive, and maybe you hear some turkey like me preach a sermon on it, and you're like, oh, crud, I've got to forgive that person. I don't feel it. What do you do about that?
I love this question. So one of the biggest things that I've personally experienced when it comes to this for different reasons is just the willingness to ask God to change my heart. And I think that that's a good place to start because it takes honesty and transparency. It's almost a confession within itself to say, God, I don't want to do this. I know you've asked me to do this, but I don't want to do it. And if I'm being honest, there's zero part of me that wants to do it, but I do want to please you. So can you help me have the desire to forgive? Like that for me is like, can we just back up and start there? Because I hate being fake. I don't like to do things and it's not authentic, it's not genuine. And I do think that's inclusive of forgiveness and just sometimes even the logistics of how you interact with someone. Like you see someone that there's a little something going on under there, and I'm not the person who's gonna be like, hey, cheers, smile, because it's just not genuine. And so I think a good place to start when you have those feelings and emotions is to bring them before the Creator who gave them to you and say, hey, can you help me want to do this? Because I do want to, I'm just not there. I'm not there at all.
I think that's so helpful. Sometimes I think one of the struggles, sorry, I'm blocked from some of you over there. Some of the struggle is some of us find it difficult to be in touch with our emotions, maybe because there's been trauma in the past. and we've taken those emotions and like put them in this vault and closed it off. So any thoughts on what do you do when you sort of answered the side of the question, what do you do when you've got feelings that you don't want to forgive? But what about when you just feel numb and yet there's been injury? Should you go ahead and forgive, or do you need to kind of try to find that vault and open up those emotions? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So just to make sure I understand, it's what do we do when we know we've been hurt, but we haven't even began the process of
That's right.
processing?
You're like, you might even have a friend say, that was wrong what that person did. And you're like, wait, what? It's that kind of.
That's a tricky one. If I'm being honest, I've been in situations where people have expected me to respond a certain way. So my first instinct is to take some time to ask myself, like, should I really be upset? Or, like, I don't want someone's frustration to be imposed upon me.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth the reflection of, like, I know you think I should be upset, but maybe the reason I don't feel upset is because I'm actually not upset. And it doesn't mean that they didn't do anything wrong, but maybe God has already begun that work in my heart where I'm able to move on from that. But there could be other situations maybe you guys could speak on, but that's just my opinion.
Do you have any thoughts, Melissa, on the person that feels numb, where they look around and see other people experiencing emotions over injury, and they're like, I'm kind of a robot.
Well, I think kind of to what Chelsey was saying is it's important to make sure that it's not that someone else is putting those things on you. I tend to believe that if we don't look at our feelings, then they come out sideways somewhere else. And so it's worth trying to figure out, like, okay, am I really okay? Let me sit with this for a few days. Let me, like, kind of reach out to the people who know me best and be like, help me see what I'm not seeing. Like, where are my blind spots?
That's so good.
Yeah.
Very good, both of you. Clint, hello. Let's talk about a light angle to this.
I'm going to need you to ask for forgiveness later for the way you keep introducing me.
Duly noted. Let me ask kind of a collection of questions that are, I think, kind of getting at one whole dimension to this subject. How do we hold justice and forgiveness together? Does forgiveness mean, we can't hold perpetrators of injustice accountable for their behavior? What about consequences for wrongs? Let's start there, and then I've got a follow-up.
Yeah.
So forgiveness and justice.
It's a great question, and one that I feel inadequate to answer. I would say I don't want to get ahead of the script here, because I know we're going to talk about holding institutions accountable and what that looks like. But individually, maybe building off what we just heard, I kind of see a fork in the road here, where on the one hand, the gospel tells us that we have been forgiven and we should forgive generously, we should forgive readily. And yet I've often seen that masked as an unwillingness to face hurt and harm and kind of keep things copacetic. And as Melissa said, I think that comes out sideways in Christian relationships, because we feel like we are not supposed to talk about hurt and we're supposed to just forgive. And so I know we're going to get to a series of questions about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation and forgiveness.
Go ahead, because that was my follow-up, actually.
Yeah.
Because I think they're adjacent issues.
Yeah, so I think that what we really have to do is we have to define our terms. That's sort of my answer to everything sometimes. It's my Rosetta Stone. But what does it really mean to forgive? Because it's one of those words that the church uses and that Christians use so wildly and so, I think, with a range of possible meanings. And I think we have to really whittle down for ourselves and for our communities, well, what is forgiveness? It comes from a word that means to give. So it means that we give something to someone. We give them the benefit of the doubt, or we interpret their actions generously, perhaps. But I worry that we too often collapse the distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation and trust. And so I think both from a mental health perspective, which I am not qualified to comment on, but from a theological perspective, we have to do a really good job of figuring out our taxonomy of the terms that
So what is reconciliation then?
Well, reconciliation, I mean, it comes from the Latin,
Of course he would say that.
conciliare, means to be friendly, to make friends. And in fact, you'll hear reconcile, it has that root re again, right? It's the act of repeatedly
that's interesting.
restoring a friendly, intimate relationship. And so there are times where I think the command of the gospel is not that we must reconcile with everyone and everything. The command is if there is one, and I think there is, it's to be people who are ready to forgive. And so then we have to do the hard, I think, work in our heart of figuring out, well, how can I forgive yet maintain the boundary that I need to maintain when I'm not ready to reconcile that way? And so I think, again, that's a mental health, that's a therapy. I think I found therapy really helpful on that specific question. But from a theological perspective, I think the church, if I'm going to be honest, needs to do a better job of defining these terms together in relationship and even from the pulpit about how we really live out Jesus' call to command. And I'll say one last thing, which is the Rosetta Stone for me. There's many stories and verses about forgiveness. I did some research this week. I typed into Google Bible verses about forgiveness, and I read some of them. But the Rosetta Stone for me is actually Jesus and Matthew saying, love your neighbors yourself. In this, love God and love your neighbors yourself. In this is the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets. And so I really think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to forgive, means what does it mean to love another the way I love myself? And if you're honest with that question, you do the work of that question, you realize sometimes even with ourselves we have to set up boundaries and accountabilities. So if we do that within our own heart, why not do that with our relationships?
So let's talk for a little bit longer about boundaries, and maybe back to Melissa on this. Do you have some wisdom for us on how to recognize in complex situations where boundaries are necessary? And then, I guess, what does that even look like?
Boundaries are complicated. There's a book by Henry Cloud from, I think, the 90s, maybe the 80s.
It's a good book.
It's called Boundaries,
Yep.
And it is a great book. There's a workbook. There's boundaries for kids, boundaries in relationships. And I think we can toss out the term boundary without really realizing how it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of patience to put a boundary in place, because usually people don't respond well to boundaries. So I could say, hey, Leo, I don't appreciate how you're speaking to me, and so I'm no longer willing to engage with you when you have that tone of voice. And he can be like, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no, we can try again tomorrow. Almost like you're talking to an angry 2-year-old, when you have a calm body and a calm voice, I would love to talk to you about this.
They respond almost the same.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. Children are often better at it.
Yes, sometimes. But I think boundaries often can look like, because hurt people, right? And we are all broken sinners, and we are all going to make mistakes, and we are all going to inevitably hurt other people. And I try to see as more, how do we respond, or how do they respond when they hurt us? And then, okay, if they can't respond in the way that I need, then what would a boundary look like?
All right, let's talk a little bit more about painful injuries, really, really complex painful injuries. For instance, I've had people come to me at times over the years and incredibly courageous, open up about, being a child in a sexually abusive even, home, and what does it mean? I mean, they're basically saying, am I supposed to forgive my parent? Put differently, the perpetrator of that gross injustice against them. What does that even look like? Do you have any thoughts on that? I do.
Go. I'll push it back to you for a minute and then chime in, because I do think that is such a complex and individual conversation to be had. I think it's important to kind of start to separate the noodles per se of like, okay, what was this person's mental health status?
Yes.
What was going on? But the reality is your parent who's supposed to protect you failed you. And so it's also at what cost is not forgiving them costing you?
Yeah. I think first and foremost is the safety and well-being of the victim. And even for a lot of people, coming to the point where they are able to say that they're a victim. I mean, I remember with one individual years ago that I was speaking to, when I said that word, they got like really angry. It's like that vault opened up and a bunch of emotions came out because they weren't a victim from their parent who had perpetrated the abuse. But of course, they were. And there's that process of beginning to deal with these things. So I think framing it not in sort of, I think sometimes more conservative Christianity can place this, this almost like a hammer of forgiveness upon people. One-dimensional, and these are not one-dimensional situations. So I think it's reframing it, prioritizing the safety of the victim, their well-being, and again, disclaimer, I'm no expert on these things, but I do know that abuse is very closely connected to control. And to the degree to which the victim goes through a process where they can, in some measure, forgive the perpetrator, might release some of that psychological control that person still has over you. I don't know if that makes any sense. Feel free to correct anything I just said.
I would absolutely agree with that. That by holding on to the anger at times, it can like eat you alive, like rat poison. And so it's in recognizing that they still have that control over you because they're still giving you that emotion by what you experienced, and forgiving them kind of starts to cut that tie.
Cool. All right, let's go a little lighter now to Chelsey. Would you talk a little bit about, sometimes I've heard parents say, oh gosh, my child saw me blow it today. And they can't see me as a failure. I'm supposed to be this role model. My question is, wouldn't it be healthy? It's not healthy to blow it in front of your child per se, but isn't it healthy once that's happened to see it as an opportunity for the parent to show the child what forgiveness actually looks like? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in my house, when I grew up, adults never apologized to children. Maybe some of you have that same experience. My husband is Nigerian, so his parents definitely never apologize for anything.
That's a thing, apparently.
It's a thing. And the logic behind it is just, almost like the respect runs parallel to that. It's like, if I apologize, I'm relinquishing my status, as the authoritative figure. But now that I have 2 kids, it's just been so wonderful to see how powerful it is to show our children what forgiveness looks like by asking them for it. And so for a good example of this is when I had my second. So if you don't know, I have 2 children. I have a 4-year-old and I have a little boy who will be 2 on Monday. And there was a time after baby came, my second, I'm postpartum, I'm full rage, and everything is frustrating because I'm exhausted. And I remember I snapped at my daughter because she was simply trying to help me. But when you're in the mode and you're like, I can do it by myself because the baby's there's just a lot going on. And I snapped at her and I could see like everything just shut down, like everything. And I felt like the worst person in the whole wide world because she's looking at me like, why, I'm trying to help. Yeah, why would you do that to me? And so it took me, and I'm not going to play perfect mommy, it took me a few minutes after the baby wasn't crying anymore to process myself. Like, I remember that look on my daughter's face. And I went back to her, and I said, Cadence, earlier, mommy, was very mean to you, and I'm so sorry. I'm just very tired, but that's not an excuse for me to hurt you that way. I'm sorry. And I asked her, do you forgive me? And she said no. She
go,
said
girl.
No. Just made it better. She said no. She said no. And I said, you know what? I understand why you would feel that way, but I'm going to come back in a few minutes, and I'm going to say sorry again. And hopefully after you think about it, you can forgive mommy, because I'm really sorry. And I did that. I went back to her.
That's so sweet.
Yes, this time with treats. And I
gotta
said,
do what
sorry.
you gotta do, right?
Listen, we're going to talk about it. Let's talk about it. And I said sorry again, but this time I was bearing gifts. And she accepted my apology that time. But I mean, even just the transition from her from 2, she was about, going on to 3 at that time. Now she's 4. I can see that in her. Like, I can see that my husband and I have practiced forgiveness. We've asked her, we've said sorry, because she's more willing to do that with us, but also with other kids. And so I do think it's very important for parents to model that. And it's not just God wants us. Okay, well, if God wants us to do it, mommy, daddy, what does that look like? Because yesterday you were kind of mean to me, and I'm going to need an apology for that, right? So I think it's great to do that.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it true? Like, when children feel like they're getting a lecture from their parents on a subject, it's going to, particularly the older they get, fall on deaf ears. If they feel like their parent is broken, is humble, and willing to, in essence, confess their sin to them, it's so powerful. I've often told, when I've done, premarital counseling, I've said, look, to couples, if you have children someday, one of the most powerful things you can do is to, in your relationship with one another, to model repentance, to confess your sin and seek forgiveness and grant forgiveness, because children are learning those things instinctively. I know one of your areas of expertise is working with children, child play therapy and such. Can you talk a little bit about this from your angle?
Yeah, loved everything you said. I often tell parents that the circle back is what's most important, like the repair, because we're all going to screw up and say the wrong thing, and we're going to lose our marbles. But it's the circle back that shows the kids, like, hey, it's okay to make mistakes. Even mom and dads make mistakes, and like, this is what we do when we make a mistake. And so it's being able and willing to say, hey, mom should not have yelled. I am so sorry. I bet that was really scary. Can you tell me how you feel now? And do you forgive me? Like, asking for their forgiveness. And I think you're absolutely right. The more you practice it and model it, the more you see it showing up in how they interact with friends and teachers and all of those things as well.
Very cool. Okay, let's shift, and now let's go back to Clint here. You alluded to it earlier. One of the major areas, I think, of this topic, particularly as we think about those of us who would describe ourselves as Christian, institutions like the church have caused extraordinary hurt to so many, unspeakable pain. In someone who's been hurt by a church or a Christian organization, are they supposed to forgive that organization, that institution? What does that even look like?
Yeah. So many thoughts on this. And I think it actually is an interesting segue. It's not that different in a way from talking about parenting, because those of you who are parents right now, you're navigating not just your own relationship with your children, but also, I think, let's just name the elephant in the room, a really shifting landscape of like church life in the 21st century. And there's a lot of like political and theologically charged things that are happening that you as a parent are trying to decipher what you believe about it, and your kids are being exposed to it. And maybe that's true of every moment in church history, but it just, to me, as a sideline observer, feels like decision fatigue must be a lot. And that's true even for me without children, and for those of you who are just considering whether you can belong to churches. The thought that occurs to me when Leo asked that question about institutional failure is, a bit of a hard segue here, but I remember watching a clip after 9/11 where Bill Maher, if you know that sort of talking head, said about Islam. He was really angry that, when there's enough bad apples, there's something wrong with the tree. And I remember feeling at the moment, I was young and naive, like sort of been, I don't know, as a young Christian or whatever I was, it's like, yeah. And now as an adult Christian, I'm like, seems like there's a lot of bad apples in Christianity too, and it seems like we're reading stories every week where we're like, gosh, at what point does the scale tip? And I don't know that I can trust whatever's happening. I think what's happening in the church is a lot of bad actions and a lot of bad behavior grows out of a pursuit and a protection of power. And a lot of what forgiveness is, both requesting and receiving, or both requesting and giving, is it's actually a ceding of power. To come to the point where you have to ask forgiveness. To be the kind of person that gives forgiveness is to let go of the leg up that you have in the discourse or in the hurt. And I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all, but I think we need to acknowledge that institutional trust in the church is as low as it's been in my lifetime. And there needs to be open and honest conversations where people's voices are being heard, and where parents are navigating and where kids are navigating, hopefully a growing era of renewed trust as churches are open to these conversations and hosting even, I think, not to toot our own horn, but to be honest about how people are feeling about the church and what seems like a glut of fallen leaders and pastors and people in authority. So I just feel really broken. I'm going to be honest with you, speaking personally for me. There are some things in the church right now and some failures that are starting to hit closer and closer to my home where I'm not really ready to forgive, and I'm working through that. When it first started to happen, maybe 10 years ago, and there were stories being written, it was not my denomination. It wasn't my particular brand of Christianity. And then it started to creep in a little bit closer and closer. And so I'm just being honest with you all that even from within where the sausage is made, I'm processing like, where is this happening? How is this happening? What institutional things need to change beyond just a discourse on forgiveness, but a forgiveness that leads to systemic and institutional adjustments that therefore allow for reconciliation. So to put my thesis on the table, it's this. We should all be prepared to forgive, but if we are hoping for reconciliation, which I think all of us are in our relationships and our relationship to the church, we need to start having conversations about what has to change in the way we do and talk about the church. That's how I feel.
Either of you want to add anything to that?
This is more of a question for you. Something that I have seen in my office with kind of, as you're saying, things are getting closer and closer to home for a lot of us, is the difficulty in separating God from the church. And at times the inability for friends and for clients who have to completely walk away because they cannot separate or imagine separating God from the institution. Do you have anything to say on that?
I'll be really quick because I talked a lot there, but I think two quick thoughts. One is I think sometimes people in positions of authority try to play that card as a way of absconding from responsibility, where it's like, listen, people fail, the church failed you, but God has not failed you. That's true theologically, but it might not be the right timing and moment to say that when people are hurting and need restoration. So from the position of power, we need to open up space where people can process and not rush to throw theology at people and hide behind that theology. From a position of those who are hurting, I think through therapy and through trusted relationships, we need to, that's the gospel, that people will fail us, that Jesus does not fail us, and that his good news to us is good news in every generation. But that has to happen from people alongside you. I think when it's coming from the power down, especially in situations where there's hurt, I don't know that that's a recipe for success.
It's very good. One thing I would add, and it really ties together with the earlier conversation about abuse, sexual and otherwise. Where I have seen the greatest healing in individuals. It's when they have taken the courageous step to put themselves into therapy. And it's not easy to do. It is incredibly vulnerable. I can say this in front of someone I deeply respect. You know, oftentimes you'll go to a therapist and it's just not a good fit, you know. And so I say, look, it's okay. Like you've probably had that experience with a physician or with a car repair person or someone. Have the freedom and courage to go to several therapists if you need to before you find one that fits. And one individual I'm thinking of, is I know this person's story very deeply. I personally had recommended 2 therapists that ended up being disasters for this person. And I just thought, there's never going to be healing here. And this person was already out the door of Christianity, having grown up in a very conservative evangelical home. Someone else recommended a therapist, and it has been life-changing. You know, fast forward probably 10 years later, the healing that I've been privileged to see in this person's life, it is just mind-boggling to me. So,
can I add one thing to that?
Yeah, please.
I mean, in addition to that, or maybe I think it can be intimidating when people hear like try multiple. It feels like such an investment. You know, you like put it on your calendar, you go, you do it, it doesn't work. After 1 or 2 or 3 of those, you're like, it's just not going to work. I have found, and I'm sort of speaking on behalf. Dangerous to say this, but my wife is a clinical social worker. Part of the work of therapy is actually saying that it's not working to the therapist. Like part of it is saying like, this is our 3rd session. I don't think you understand fill in the blank. My faith, I don't think you understand like where I'm coming from with this. It may not be the one size fits all. You may still have to keep looking, but part of the work is actually coming to a place where you can be honest with a professional about what you're feeling. Because in the therapeutic space, transference, countertransference, they're thinking things unconsciously, you're thinking, it is so complicated. And so to lower that veneer just slightly and say, I don't know, I know I need help, but this doesn't feel like it's helping. Can we talk about that? Rather than just cancel your appointments and wait a month and try someone else. I think we live in this consumer culture, and not sticking with like a few sessions is sometimes part of the problem.
That's good. All right, let me shift categories. Have you ever had a situation, I have, where someone randomly comes up to you and says, I just want you to know I forgive you. And I'm like, okay. You're completely clueless what they're talking about. How do you make sense of something like that? Does anyone want to interact with that? Am I the only one?
So Leo brought this up on this past Tuesday, and I had a different reaction then than I do now. I will say that. Yeah. So that's definitely happened to me before. And the thing that made it worse was there was 0 explanation and 0 interaction afterward. So till today, I have no idea
It's
what
so
I did.
bizarre.
I have no clue what I did in the first place to need forgiveness from that person. On Tuesday, when you brought this up, my initial response is just frustration and like, okay, good riddance. But but as I've kind of thought about it throughout the week, even up until now, and really doing what Clint expressed, which is defining what forgiveness is. And this is going to sound so radical, but it actually prompted me to pray for that person. And it wasn't from a place of like, Lord, help them to do things that make sense. It wasn't from that place. It was more so from a place of, one, if there's something that I did that I still do now, like right now, because I really don't know, would you reveal that to me and would you help me to change? And 2, actually praying for that person, because I would define forgiveness as the willingness to let go of the anger, resentment, the willingness to let go and almost accept that I myself will not get revenge. But this is the hard part about forgiveness, is realizing that sometimes I may never see what I would define as justice for that situation. and accepting that. Like, I'm accepting all those things. That's what I mean when I say forgive. So for them to say that to me, whatever that meant, Lord, would you heal any wounds in their heart? Whether I did it or maybe somebody behind me is doing the same thing. But it brought me to a place of prayer because I realized, like, what if I really did do something and I may still do it now? You know, it just, I would want
Chelsey, I want to
that,
be like
so.
you when I grow up. That's beautiful. I don't mean to minimize it all. That was really beautiful. What about, so kind of take that same situation, but instead of completely being ignorant of what they're talking about, you actually know more of the history there. And and what comes into your mind is, I've experienced this person as relationally controlling in the past. This feels like they've taken a wonderful concept of forgiveness and maybe they're kind of weaponizing it in a way to control me. Or am I just being judgmental of them? Do you have any thoughts on how to handle that when you're wondering if someone is, you look at your relationship with them over time, you go, they feel like a controlling person that's unhealthy, and now this is just another tactic to control me. How do you differentiate between what you really need to do, the path that Chelsey's outlined, or just, like, again, impose a boundary?
I think there's probably a happy medium of doing both, of being not making the assumption necessarily that they're coming from a malicious place or from a controlling place, and recognizing, okay, let's believe that today they're trying their best and they're really needing to offer that to me for themselves, and saying, okay, I hear you, and thank you for sharing that with me, and now I'm going to go. Now I'm going to pray because, now.
Boy, am I going to pray for you.
And I will tell y'all, I have a pretty strong personality, and I often have to apologize to my friends for, like, coming across too harshly or saying things too bluntly. And they're like, oh, it's fine. And I was like, well, I knew what I said wasn't fine. Like, I knew, like, that was a hurtful thing for me to say, and I'm really sorry. And that's after, 30 years of therapy that I can recognize some of those things. But I think part of it is having that self-awareness, like you're saying, like, maybe that's something that they need, that's okay for them to give you, and you can just let it be what it is.
It's really good. I can't relate, though, on having the strong personality.
Sorry.
So I'm just going to have to take that by faith. I was in a setting with friends this week where I had to, stop myself somehow in the middle of it and just go, I'm so sorry. Maybe it's that I'm preaching on forgiveness this Sunday, but I'm just so sorry. So thank you. All right, we're in cleanup time here. So you all be thinking about anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to, and let me ask this question for you to react to. It's more of a big, overarching question. React to this statement. How freely we forgive tells a lot about what we truly believe. Anybody?
That's pretty hard. And this is just like reaction to that statement. Just a reaction.
Yeah. Off the cuff. What's the connection between how freely we give and what we believe?
I do think there is a strong connection between how freely we forgive and what we believe. This hits home for me because it wasn't until my second year of marriage, after going through things my first year of marriage, that I realized that I didn't really believe that God was good. And I didn't know that was something I struggled with until I was now an adult who's in marriage, who have had things happen. And I'm just like, God, you're in control and this is happening. And the real question is, and you want me to believe that you're good? Right? Like that was really the struggle. And the more that I grounded myself in believing that God is actually good, the more willing I was and am to forgive when people are a part of the things that are happening that are not good. So I do believe there's a strong connection between what we believe and how freely we forgive.
I think that's beautifully said. I think my initial was, when I heard it, I was like, oh, immediately forgive. And I think that's where, I don't know if it's like a cultural thing where it's like you feel like you need to immediately be like, oh, I'm so sorry. Or like, it's okay, don't worry about it. And I think forgiveness can come in time and as part of the process.
That's right. In other words, we can have these instincts as Christians, our cultural formation as Christians, where we have to, but it's complicated, right?
Can you repeat it, that little phrase again? How
freely we forgive tell us what we truly believe.
Yeah, I think this is related. I'm not entirely sure, but as I was meditating on it this week, I was thinking about, and Melissa just said this 2 comments ago, but I think forgiveness is really connected to self-awareness. The thought, the sort of like thesis statement in my own mind this week was that forgiveness is kind of a medicine that helps treat a sometimes fatal lack of self-awareness. Because when we're in a rhythm of both self-forgiveness and forgiving others, and also asking for forgiveness, what we're doing is we're having, I think, a biblical way of reflecting on our own actions that without a rhythm of forgiveness, we don't naturally have in our day-over-day life, right? So it's like when I'm thinking, like, do I need to ask for forgiveness? I often live my neurotic life in a self-awareness vortex where I'm thinking, like,
Could you say that line one more time?
Where I think to myself, I'm a self-aware person. I've said this before. Some of you heard. I'm a self-aware person, and then I go, would a self-aware person think they're self-aware? And then I'm like, but wait a minute. I'm a self-aware person doubting my self-awareness and wondering. And I can play that game I'm just
truly you have a dizzying intellect.
Now I'm wondering, is this a joke at my expense that I don't understand that I need to think about? Regardless, I have a hard time getting out of the self-awareness vortex where and it becomes egomaniacal. And for me, forgiveness has been like prayer, like meditation, like other things, a way of just stopping the machinery and saying, I don't know. Ultimately, part of being mortal and human is I say a lot, I don't know. But I can ask for forgiveness when I know I'm wrong. And I can communicate a need for healing when I know I'm hurt. And that, to me, is a medicine. I think it comes across in the gospel as a command. I think it's more of like a path to healthy living. And viewing it less as you better forgive because you're a Christian, seeing it more as like a healing act for ourselves and others is much more beneficial, I think.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, so that when we see these verses in the Bible that are true, dictums, forgive as the Lord has forgiven you. You see that through line, I think, in the New Testament. Certainly one of the ideas in the passage today. If kind of, as Melissa was saying, if your first instinct is to see that as kind of a paste on, that would lead you to transactional but superficial forgiveness, no, that's not the intent behind that. It's designed, all these statements, I believe, in the scriptures are designed for us to do that difficult, deep work in our heart, processing the range of injuries that might be represented in a situation, and then trying to bring the truth of the gospel, drive it down deep into our heart. As Pam beautifully put it in her story of grace this morning, where you're taking the pain from your experience and then trying to take the specific good news of the gospel that intersects at that point of pain and personalizing it, speaking that peace to you, praying it deep in your heart, as Chelsey was saying. Big thanks to our conversation partners today, Melissa, Chelsey, and Clint. Give it up for them, please.